Becky from Massachusetts has our next question. The ESV reading of Deuteronomy 32:17 is, quote, "They sacrificed to demons that were no gods, to gods they had never known, to gods that had come recently, whom your fathers had never dreaded," end quote. What is the significance of the phrase, quote, "new gods that had come recently," end quote, especially the recently part?
Yeah. Well, I'll get to that, but let me say first, the ESV translation of Deuteronomy 32:17 is awful. It's one of the few translations that will have something like they sacrificed to demons that were no gods, plural. Now you think about that. Oh, the demons, okay, they're not gods. And then the very next phrase is to gods. They sacrificed to gods they had never known. Well, are they gods or are they not? It's a self-contradicting translation. And it's a very poor translation. I suspect that whoever did the translation felt uncomfortable with divine plurality here. What you actually have, and I have a published journal article on this that I don't think it's freely accessible. It might be. You might be able to find it with Google. It's the title something like, it's Deuteronomy 32:17, or does Elohim in Deuteronomy 32:17, should it be translated gods or something like that? Anyway, what the text actually says is they sacrificed to Shadim, demons, in this English translation, not Eloah. Eloah is singular. It's only, always and only singular. So you should not be translating it with a plural. It should say they sacrificed to demons, not God, to gods they had never known. Now that makes perfect sense. It doesn't contradict itself. So let's just adding that, the ESV here is just not good on this particular verse. And I think it is fair to say most other English translations will do much better with the verse than that. Now about the newly, the recent, gods that they had recently, they had never known, gods had come along recently, so on and so forth. We have to, again, put ourselves in the historical situation. Israel had a relationship with Yahweh first. Then later, they went after other gods. So the phrasing here refers to the chronology of the story of biblical Israel. They're brought out of Egypt. They journey to Sinai. They enter into a covenant with Yahweh at Sinai, the God of their fathers. They start journeying to the land promised by the earlier covenant, the one made at Sinai, and the promise is made to the patriarchs. And then they apostatize. A lot of Israelites go off and start worshiping other gods. Either, once they get into the land, when they have the conquest episodes, the end of Joshua, especially the beginning of Judges, comments on this, that God, forsakes them because they intermingle with the population they should have driven out, and they start worshiping those other gods. So this is what it has in mind. This eventually, this beginning relationship with Yahweh, the God of Israel, the God of the Bible, the God of their fathers, and then they drift off into worshiping new gods that just had come along much more recently in their history, that they're not part of their ancient past, and they apostatize. Now, I want to add one other thought here. This question is a really insightful question in another respect, and that is, think about the wording. And the wording and the story of biblical Israel pretty much requires that Deuteronomy 32 had to have been written after the conquest. Okay. After or subsequent to the end of the conquest, the beginning of the book of Judges, and therefore not by Moses. Because you can only make this comment about Israel going after other gods they had not known until recently, after it happened. And that didn't happen in the Mosaic period. The only alternative, would be to say, well, maybe maybe Moses wrote this and he's thinking about an apostasy in Egypt. Well, we don't have any biblical record of that. What we do have is a biblical record of Israel being taken out of Egypt, brought to Sinai, covenant with God, the God of their fathers. We don't read about any mass apostasy while they're down in Egypt. And then they journey to the promised land. They don't, carry out, God's directions completely. They intermingle with the populations and they wind up worshiping other gods. Okay, for Deuteronomy 32, at this point of Deuteronomy 32 to make sense, that's hindsight. That's the kind of thing that you get in hindsight in Israel's history. So part of this Song of Moses, I think, at least at this verse, and maybe some of the other parts very clearly, are looking back on something that happened post Moses. And I say this is insightful because this is the kind of thing you run into elsewhere in the Torah, and really in other parts of the Bible too, where we assume that it was written during a certain time by a certain person, even though it's not really claimed. I mean, there's no reason that we have to take the phrase "law of Moses" and presume that Moses wrote every word of this. We've had this discussion before on the podcast, and I'm what used to be called a supplementarian. I think that Moses, there's a core to the Pentateuch that Moses either wrote or had dictated or something. It's specifically connected with the lifetime of Moses, and then it gets accrued to by other people in the prophetic tradition. And ultimately, again, we had a question a couple Q&As ago about Genesis 1 through 11. Again, which I view a lot of that work either editorially or maybe in some cases compositionally done during the exile, specifically to poke the Babylonian gods and their religion in the eye. You have things like this happen in the Torah. All law of Moses means, Torat Moshe. It can mean the law that originated with Moses. It can mean the law that was produced by Moses. It can also mean the law that is associated with Moses. Moses is the central character for most of the Torah. And so it's very natural to think of it as the law of Moses. It could be, the law that, not only is associated with Moses, but the law that, refers, it is what it is in reference to the character of Moses. I mean, there are different ways to understand the semantics. Realize that this is in Hebrew, this is a simple, what they call a construct phrase, an X of Y relationship between two nouns. The construct phrase has its own semantics. There are 12, 15 different categories, different ways of thinking about how noun of noun relationships work, what they're trying to say. They're different semantic categories, not just one. So, there's no reason to think that or require that Moses had to write every word. Even with Jesus, quotes passages and attributes it to the law of Moses. Well, what else would he call it? By Jesus' day, it's the Torah, it's the law. That's what it's known as. If he calls it something else, they're not going to know what he's talking about. He also refers to other books that don't really even have stated authors. They just get named after the main characters. Samuel. That sort of thing. Again, we have to make sure that how we think about Scripture. Actually, it's going to sound kind of crazy, but oftentimes the way we think about inspiration, the Bible itself gets in the way of our theology. Okay, we need to put the brakes on that. How we think about inspiration and how we think about issues like this, like authorship and whatnot, our conclusions actually need to conform to the Bible itself, to the Scripture itself. We can't formulate an idea and then kind of ignore stuff that we run into. But often what happens is we do formulate ideas, and then we run into passages like this, and we make the passage stand on its head so that we can still keep our idea, the way we think about a certain topic. And that isn't being text driven. So we want to try to be text driven. It's what we do here at the Naked Bible Podcast, or at least we try. And I think this question, again, brings us to one of those points where we really have to think about what we're looking at.